Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I'm Jawad Hami and these are the headlines. Afghan President Ashraf Ghani says his government will soon release the remaining Taliban prisoners to complete the prisoner swap. Speaking at an event in Kabul, Ghani said peace talks with the Taliban could start in a week's time. Meanwhile, the Taliban have declared a 3-day ceasefire on account of Eid al-Adha. Former Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak has been sentenced to 12 years in jail and fined around $50 million in the first trial over the multi-billion-dollar scandal. He was found guilty in all 7 charges of corruption in the first of the 5 cases linked to the 1MDB state fund. He also became the first Malaysian Prime Minister to be convicted in criminal court. In Iraq, another protester died after being shot with a tear gas canister in clashes with police in Baghdad. This brings the death toll from violence in anti-government protest to 3 in 2 days. The protests against corruption and unemployment resumed months after the COVID-19 pandemic brought them to a halt. Nearly 500 people were killed during last year's protests. The worldwide number of COVID-19 deaths has crossed 654,000 with over 16.4 million cases. In the US, 1,057 more people have died while over 54,000 have tested positive in the last 24 hours. The country's death toll has exceeded 148,000 while infections tally nears 4.3 million. In Pakistan, 23 more people have lost their lives with the death toll rising to 5,865 with 936 new cases. The tally of the nationwide infections has crossed 275,000. And in cricket, England beat West Indies by 269 runs in the third test at Old Trafford to clinch the series 2-1. West Indies were all out for 129 while chasing a target of 399 runs. Stuart Broad was declared man of the match and series. He took 16 wickets, including 10 in the last match, to complete his 500-wicket haul. Those were the headlines and detailed stories right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. We start our news bulletin from Afghanistan, where President Ashraf Ghani says his government will soon release the remaining Taliban prisoners to complete the prisoner swap. Speaking at an event in Kabul, Ghani said peace talks with the Taliban could start in a week's time. The announcement by the president has sparked hopes for peace in the war-torn country. The prisoner swap has been the main obstacle to long-delayed intra-Afghan negotiations since the signing of the Doha peace deal in February. Once completed, it will pave the way for the withdrawal of the foreign troops from Afghanistan. As of now, the Afghan government has released more than 4,000 Taliban prisoners in exchange for nearly 700 security personnel. The two sides are required to release a total of 6,000 prisoners. Meanwhile, Taliban have declared a 3-day ceasefire on account of Eid al-Adha, but warned of a stern action if their fighters are attacked. In Malaysia, former Prime Minister Najib Razak has been sentenced to 12 years in jail over graft charges. He was guilty in all 7 charges of corruption in the first of 5 cases linked to the 1MDB state fund. The conviction comes just 6 days after the High Court ordered Razak to pay the government $400 million in unpaid taxes and penalties. Criminal charges were levelled after his defeat in 2018 elections when his successor Mahathir Mohamad reopened investigations. He has also become the first Malaysian Prime Minister to be convicted in a criminal court. Speaking after the ruling, the former Prime Minister said he will file an appeal against the verdict. Moving on to Iraq, where another protester died after being shot with a tear gas canister in clashes with police in Baghdad. This brings the death toll from violence in anti-government protests to 3 in 2 days. The protests against corruption and unemployment resumed months after the COVID-19 pandemic brought them to a halt. Nearly 500 people were killed during last year's protests. The renewed wave of protests is a test for Iraq's new Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi, who sworn into office in May. Al-Kadhimi has promised a dialogue with the protesters and has requested comprehensive lists of all those who have been killed in the protests. Meanwhile, in Iraq, 3 Katyusha rockets hit Camp Ataji military base, which houses US-led coalition forces in northern Baghdad. In a statement, the Iraqi military said a helicopter was damaged in the strikes. It said the rockets were launched from Sabah al-Bur neighborhood and fell on an area of the base used by Iraqi forces. The coalition said none of its personnel was injured in the raid. The rocket strike is the latest in a long-running series of low-intensity air attacks on military bases in Iraq. No group has yet claimed the responsibility for the strikes. Turkey says it has killed 3 militants of the Kurdistan Workers' Party in airstrikes during Operation Claw Tiger in northern Iraq. The ministry said Turkey will continue to destroy weapon caches and shelters used by the terrorists. It said over 400 Kurdish militants have been killed in northern Iraq over the past 5 months. State media said PKK militants often use northern Iraq to plan cross-border terrorist attacks in Turkey. Lebanon's Prime Minister Hassan Diab says Israel has violated the country's sovereignty with a dangerous military escalation along the border. In a tweet, Diab urged caution after the rise in border tensions. The Prime Minister said Israel is trying to change the rules of engagement. Meanwhile, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said his country would do everything to defend itself. He said Israel is prepared for any scenario. The statements come a day after Israel accused Hezbollah of infiltrating the frontier. Hezbollah has denied the claims. The worldwide number of COVID-19 deaths has crossed 654,000 with over 16.4 million cases. In the US, 1,075 more people have died, while over 54,000 people tested positive in the last 24 hours. The country's death toll has exceeded 148,000, while infections tally nears 4.3 million. More in this report.
With hundreds of thousands getting infected every day across the globe, the World Health Organization has warned the pandemic is accelerating. California is the latest of the U.S. states that have now run out of healthcare facilities and professionals as cases hit the roof. After Brazil and Mexico suffering the worst in Latin America, cases and deaths in Venezuela are now rising to unprecedented levels. But the country, already reeling from an economic crisis, has limited options when it comes to reimposing restrictions.
Venezuela is in default with the bank for just over $700 million. The rules of the bank mean that when there is a default of that size, there is absolutely nothing we can do.
The second wave of the new coronavirus is now gripping Europe as countries reimpose several restrictions. Calling London's 14-day quarantine decision unjust, Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez appealed to the regional countries not to cut travel ties.
Before we reproach each other, let's try to find a balance where, above all, the British authorities base their decision on the cumulative incidents, that is to say, on the evolution of the epidemic in these territories which are tourist destinations, which I insist are safe for British tourists.
China recorded 68 new cases, the highest daily figure since April, due to clusters in 3 separate regions. In Indonesia, the total number of cases has topped 100,000. Over in Australia, while the pace of the outbreak in Victoria refuses to slow down, new clusters emerging in Belmur have added to the government's worries.
Meanwhile, in Pakistan, nearly 88% of COVID-19 patients have recovered so far as the country sees a sharp decline in new cases. The health ministry said 23 people have died while 936 infections were detected in the last 24 hours. The ministry said the countrywide death toll has risen to nearly 6,000 with over 275,000 confirmed cases. It said there are nearly 27,000 active cases in Pakistan, among which 1,217 are in critical condition. The southern province of Sindh is worst hit with nearly 119,000 cases, while Punjab has reported more than 92,000 infections. In Indian-occupied Kashmir, up to 25,000 people have been granted bogus domicile certificates, raising fears of the beginning of a demographic change. New Delhi's law makes it possible for people from outside the territory to become permanent residents. Kashmiri leaders say the rule is aimed at changing the Muslim majority status of occupied Kashmir through illegal Hindu settlers. India abrogated Article 370 of its constitution last year, revoking the special status of the disputed valley. This opened the doors for non-Kashmiris to buy property. Pakistan has opposed the domicile law, calling it a violation of international law and the UN resolutions. China says the South China Sea is not Hawaii of the US and its attempts to destabilize the region will not succeed. In a briefing, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman said some American politicians are trying to stir trouble in the South China Sea. Wang Wenbin said Beijing's policy on the South China Sea has not changed. Wang said the US wants to see nothing but instability in the region. The remarks came after US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said that South China Sea is not China's maritime empire. Earlier, China said it firmly opposes comments from Australia that Beijing's territorial claims over the South China Sea is unlawful.
China's territorial sovereignty and maritime rights and interests in the South China Sea were developed throughout the long course of history. They are upheld by successive Chinese governments in conformity with international law.
China says Hong Kong's government will suspend crime-related assistance agreements with the UK, Canada and Australia. This comes after the three countries suspended extradition treaties with Hong Kong over China's new security law. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin says the move by the countries is gross interference in China's internal matters. Canada, Britain and Australia are part of the Five Eyes intelligence alliance. The other member, New Zealand, has also suspended its extradition treaty with the territory. Wellington says it cannot trust that Hong Kong's criminal justice system is independent of China, while the United States has also hinted at doing the same. Moving on, North Korea's Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un says Pyongyang's nuclear weapons will deter any potential war in the Korean peninsula. In a speech carried by the state media, Kim said country's nukes are developed to stave off another armed conflict. Marking the 67th anniversary of the end of the Korean War, Kim said Pyongyang is capable of defending itself from imperialist forces. This comes amid stalled talks with the US over dismantling Pyongyang's weapons program in exchange for sanctions relief. The bilateral tensions have been intensifying since the failed Vietnam summit between Kim and US President Donald Trump in February 2019. More stories to follow, but right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Russia says there is no need to revive an obsolete platform such as G8. This comes a day after Germany turned down US President Donald Trump's proposal of adding Russia back to the group. In a statement, Deputy Chairman of Russian Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, said nothing can be discussed without having India and China at the table. Medvedev said the existence of G7 is questionable when there is G20 and other international frameworks. He said Crimea and Ukraine are being used as an excuse not to restore the G8. Turkey's President Tayyip Erdogan and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin have discussed the recent developments in the war-torn Libya and Syria. Turkish Communications Ministry said Erdogan and Putin talked on various issues in a phone call. The ministry said both the leaders agreed to maintain cooperation and dialogue over bilateral relations and regional issues. It said Erdogan and Putin also discussed the recent escalation between Azerbaijan and Armenia. The two presidents stressed that there are no alternatives to diplomatic settlement of the conflict. The Kremlin said Putin stressed the importance of prevention of any actions promoting further escalation in the region. Malta's armed forces say they have rescued 95 migrants found in distress on a dinghy north of Libya's coast. Volunteer organization Alarm Phone confirmed the migrants have been brought ashore at a military base near the capital, Valletta. Alarm Phone said the dinghy was overcrowded and tanking in water. Meanwhile, a Maltese patrol boat rescued another group of 63 migrants and put them in quarantine after one tested positive for COVID-19. Thousands try to flee the Middle East and Africa into Europe via Libya since violence spread in the region. Now moving on, Pakistan's Army Chief General Qamar Javed Bajwa says the country's defense production is only intended to ensure peace. This he said during a visit to Heavy Industries Textile near Rawalpindi city. The Army Chief was the chief guest at the handing over ceremony of Tank Al-Khalid I to the Armored Corps Regiment. According to the military's media wing, the tank was built under joint venture with China and Ukraine. During the ceremony, Tank Al-Khalid I displayed some of its outstanding capabilities, including mobility and the use of smoke screen to mask movement. The UK has resumed issuing visa for Iranians after a 10-year pause. The British Embassy said Iranian citizens will be able to apply for a visa from the center in Tehran. It said the applicants will have to follow certain safety steps to proceed with the applications. Earlier, the British ambassador to Iran, Rob Mackay, said the consulate had made plans to reopen its center in the country. He said the embassy will provide information required for receiving the UK visa in upcoming days. Yemen's Prime Minister says the international community should take strong action against Houthi blackmailing over a decaying oil tanker. Prime Minister Ma'in Abdul Malik Saeed said the rebels have reneged on promises to allow UN experts to board the tanker. Saeed urged the UN Security Council to put maximum pressure on the rebels in order to avoid an environmental disaster. He said his government will comply with all solutions that will lead to emptying the tanker. The safer tanker is carrying more than 1 million barrels of crude oil and is stranded off Yemen's city of Hudaydah. Earlier, the UN warned that the stuck tanker poses serious threat to marine life and livelihood of thousands of people. The UN says COVID-19 restrictions are pushing starving communities over the edge, risking the lives of tens of thousands of children every month. It warned farms are cut off from the markets and villages are isolated from food and medical aid. Talking to media, 4 UN agencies warned that growing malnutrition will have long-term consequences. They called on world leaders to earmark at least $2.4 billion in aid to fight the global hunger crisis. The UNICEF has declared Afghanistan a red zone, saying child malnutrition spiked from 690,000 in January to 780,000, a 13% increase. A recent survey by Johns Hopkins University showed lives of some 13,000 children on the line in Afghanistan. More than 100 people have been killed and tens of thousands displaced by floods in northeast India. The disaster has hit when New Delhi is struggling to deal with the surge of the new coronavirus cases in the country. The eastern state of Bihar is the worst hit, where 2.4 million people have been hit by floods across 11 districts. But state authorities fear matters might get worse because the Met Department has warned of more rain till August the 1st. Flooding is common during the monsoon season in the region, but this year the state has received extraordinary torrential rains. More stories to follow, but right after a short break, stay tuned. German car manufacturer Volkswagen and its associates have paid $9.8 billion in compensation to defrauded U.S. car owners. The U.S. Federal Trade Commission says the car maker paid over $9.5 billion, while its diesel supplier, Robert Bosch, paid over $300 million. The FTC said more than 86% of the consumers chose the buyback or early lease termination option instead of getting a repair. Volkswagen had offered to buy back or repair over 550,000 US vehicles after it admitting to using secret software to cheat at emissions tests in 2015. The scandal triggered a global backlash that has cost the company $33.3 billion so far. Global airlines have cut their COVID-19 recovery forecast, saying it would take until 2024 for passenger traffic to return to pre-pandemic levels. The International Air Transport Association says slow virus containment in the US and developing countries have badly affected air travel. Association's chief economist Brian Pierce says IATA has cut its 2020 passenger numbers forecast to a 55% decline. He said the second half of this year will see a slow recovery of passenger traffic. Meanwhile, the association noted that the move by Britain to quarantine arrivals from Spain has also created a lot of uncertainty for air passengers. The air industry has been badly affected due to the pandemic and disturbed businesses attached to it. Wall Street stocks drop as lawmakers gear up for grueling talks over a coronavirus relief package. Investors also weighed on a mixed batch of earnings reports from the blue chip companies. Shares of the 3M company fell over 5%, making the Dow Jones Industrial Average to slide. But shares of Pfizer rose 3% after it raised its full-year forecast on strong demand for cancer drugs and blood thinners. The indices of S&P 500 and Nasdaq Composite also traded low. Meanwhile, oil prices declined as U.S. lawmakers prepare to wrangle over an economic stimulus package. England beat West Indies by 269 runs in the third test at Old Trafford to clinch the series 2-1. West Indies were all out for 129 while chasing a target of 399 runs. Being beaten in the first test in Southampton, England came from behind to win a three-match series for the first time since 2008. Chris Woakes was the pick of the bowlers for England with 5 wickets for 50 runs. Shea Hope was the top scorer for West Indies with 31 runs as no Windies batsman was able to make a half-century. It was a special day for Stuart Broad, who was declared players of the match and the series and was also able to complete his 500-wicket haul. Broad missed the first match but took 16 wickets in the 2 he played. He took 10 for 67 in the last match and also scored a half-century in the first innings. West Indies remain without a series victory in the UK since 1988 and have now been beaten on 7 consecutive trips to this country. Stuart Broad has become the second English bowler to grab 500 wickets in the Test cricket. Broad achieved the landmark on the 5th day of the third Test against West Indies at Old Trafford. The 34-year-old removed Craig Braithwaite to follow teammate James Anderson in reaching the landmark. The list of the top Test wicket takers is headed by Muttiah Muralidharan with 800 wickets. He is followed by Australia's Shane Warne with 708 wickets. India's Anil Kumble is third in the list with 619 wickets. Broad's teammate James Anderson is also on the list with 589 wickets. Anderson is followed by Australian great Glenn McGraw with 563 wickets. West Indies legend Whitney Walsh is sixth on the list with 519 Test wickets. Stuart Broad is the latest addition in the club with 500 Test wickets. He takes the 7th spot in the list. Former Olympian Asad Malik has died in a road accident at the age of 78. Malik was a member of Pakistan's gold-winning team in 1968 Summer Olympics in Mexico. He had the honor of his action photograph of winning goal immortalized on a Pakistan postage stamp. During his illustrious career, Malik won 2 silver medals in the 1964 Summer Olympics and 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich. He was also a recipient of the Pride of Performance in 1969 and another gold medal in the World Cup 1971. And now the weather situation from around the globe. And that is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus.News.